Hey everybody, I mentioned in a previous video I'm reading a lot about Theodore Roosevelt right now. I read Theodore Rex, I'm reading The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, I'm eventually going to read Colonel Roosevelt. So, I'm getting my full fair share of Roosevelt right now. And one thing that does strike me about Theodore Roosevelt is that while he was president, the nation didn't really have a lot of crises, and what minor ones they had he handled very well. But it got me to thinking, like, as President of the United States, who were the presidents who suffered the worst crises and just didn't handle them that well, right? Like crises that came and obliterated their power or administrations almost completely. So again, there are some presidents that were faced with crises. FDR had the Great Depression and World War II. He handled both those things, stayed very popular. Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War. So there are presidents who had crises and they stepped up and really worked through them very well. Those would be the two most prominent examples. George Washington, I'd being the first president, just having to deal with the very idea of being president, and he came through it just fine. But these are the ones who had major crises that just destroyed their administrations and gave them no chance at re-election, or gave their party a very difficult time at re-elections in the future. I got some honorable mentions real quickly before I get my top five. John Quincy Adams, the rise of Jacksonian democracy. He really won a very tightly contested election in 1824. He comes in the administration, he's instantly crippled by this Jacksonianism, and he doesn't do much as president, and he's out in 4 years. He did run again. Martin Van Buren and George H.W. Bush. I actually put these two together because they both have the same sort of problem, right? Economics took them out of office, like financial crisis or panics of some type that slid the economy down and killed their chances of winning re-election. And both times, really the economic policies that slid the economy down came from the presidents before them, right? Andrew Johnson before Van Buren, or Andrew Jackson before Van Buren, and then Ronald Reagan before Bush. Those presidents' administrations implemented different economic policies, and those different economic policies had some wide-ranging effects that eventually caused some economic slide. Now, whether you agree with those changes or not, that they're necessary or not, that's a different story, but they did cause the economic slide that would kill their successors' presidential bids. And then one more honorable mention, of course, Andrew Johnson. And he was in an impossible position, right? He became president after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He was a Southerner. Congress didn't like him, so they passed really draconian legislation to keep him from wielding the power of the executive office. I don't know that anybody could have stepped up through that crisis, and being a useless president was going to kind of happen after falling Abraham Lincoln. So anyway, let's go to what I actually think are the top five. And number five is Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson in 1967, Vietnam War starts going very badly for him. He's losing popularity. Then you get the Tet Offensive in early '68, and pretty much everybody is done with Lyndon Johnson. Now, he had a lot of time before this to enact pretty serious social legislation and things, but Vietnam became sort of a testing ground, right? Vietnam, you could go all the way back to Harry Truman with how we came to be in Vietnam. And it was a bigger part of the containment policy, right? Contain communism at all costs, or Kennedy's famous memo. It's a memo, I don't know why I forgot the word memo for a second, but memo. And Lyndon Johnson sort of found how far the American people were willing to go, what point they would no longer take this sort of American empirical, however you want to view it, right? The American being in charge of stopping the spread of communism throughout the world, whether it's an empire, whether it's responsible democracy, or however you want to see that. This was the point where Americans wouldn't do it anymore, and Lyndon Johnson was just flattened out in his last year as president and had no chance of winning re-election. He knew that. That's why he chose not to run. So Lyndon Johnson gets my number five spot. Number four, I give to John Adams. John Adams suffered through a pretty interesting crisis. It was the quasi-war with France. The United States was right on the verge in 1798 of going to war with France. Now, he could have easily sided with all the Federalists, and he was basically a Federalist, even though he didn't officially associate with them, because they really wanted to go to war, and that would have made him really popular, and he could have easily won an election in 1800. But on principle, he couldn't do it. He couldn't get himself. He didn't think the United States needed a war with France. He thought it was a bad idea, and so naturally, the opposition, the Republicans, would have supported him in that, right? Well, no, because they wanted Jefferson to be president, and so they mocked Adams' ideas, and they kept pushing the idea that he actually wanted the war too, even though he didn't. And so Adams was, by his own principle, torn asunder by the quasi-war with France. That was more than he could take in his principles, and so that took down his administration, made it impossible for him to win in 1800. The Alien Sedition Acts also didn't help. That was a very bad move by John Adams. That was where he did himself in, if anything. My number 3 choice, I just talked about this last week, Grover Cleveland. His second election, 1892, he wins election again. He won in 1894, out for 4 years back in 1892. And things really fell apart in 1893 after he became president, right? He got cancer, huge economic crisis, probably the second biggest economic crisis in American history. It's really close with the Panic of 1837. But those two are massive economic crises. And he just found himself in a world of trouble, right? Having cancer, having this economic crisis, really working hard to keep the markets in a decent place. Also, it's also a period where labor and corporations were starting to conflict very violently. We had the Pullman strike, and he does not handle it well. All these things come together to really torpedo Grover Cleveland's career and that second administration of his, where he basically, after the first one where he'd been tough and really worked through some things in his first 4 years as president, his second 4 become kind of inert because of these things that take place. My number 2 choice, this is an easy one, Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was president when the Great Depression struck, right? The Republicans had been in charge of the executive office since 1921 when Warren G. Harding became president. And then in 1929, just a mere 6 months after he became president, Herbert Hoover sees the worst economic crisis in American history land, and he can do nothing. He doesn't have really bold ideas, and it was a time when we needed really bold ideas. You know, we need John Maynard Keynes economics and the New Deal to sort of bolster American morale and give us the idea that we're doing something different. For Hoover, Hoover was big on volunteerism, and he felt like people would volunteer and help out, but people were kind of panicked, and Hoover kind of panicked, but actually started resurrecting his reputation during this time. But then you have the bonus marchers strike at the end of his administration. In fact, it was in the election years in 32, where you see World War I veterans being killed by the U.S. Army under Herbert Hoover, watching them. He ordered not to happen. But yeah, the Depression and the bonus marchers all worked to take down a pretty good engineer and a pretty good guy at building up organizations, but the White House was just a little too big for him. And number one choice here, honestly, is an interesting one, is John Tyler. Now, for those who don't know, John Tyler was William Henry Harrison's vice president, and then William Henry Harrison died in office after just a little over a month. And this is the first time that ever happened. And so people just didn't know how to act. Was Tyler just holding the office? Was he actually the president? People actually called him His Excellency to his face. So John Tyler wasn't really the president in a lot of people's mind, and he was just troubled by this. And now later on down the line, when the president would die or whatever, and the vice president became president, people actually treated that guy like the president, but at first it wasn't so sure. And Tyler had a second problem, right? He was a Whig, which was the second American party under the Democrats and the Whigs. But he'd been a Democrat, and he switched over basically to move himself up politically, and he became vice president by doing so. But now the Whigs didn't really trust him, and of course the Democrats didn't really trust him because he changed sides. And so his administration was just obliterated, right? John Tyler, when you read about him, it's funny because it feels like historians almost skip over him because there's so little done while he's president, right? The slavery crisis is starting to kick up. All these things are starting to happen. This is, 1841 to 1845. The only thing he ever really gets done is after he knows he's not becoming president again, he gets Texas annexed. So that's the highlight of his administration. John Tyler suffered a crisis that just absolutely took down his administration. And just by becoming president. He's not president, we don't even talk about him, but as a result of becoming president, he became a huge crisis in and of himself. So that's my top 5 list. If you disagree with me, I'd be happy to talk about it in the comments. There are lots of other crises and things that destroyed administrations, and of course I had honorable mentions. There's things I didn't bring up here that I know we could talk about. So there you go. There's my list. I hope you find that interesting and hope it brings you a little historical perspective.